some of you touched on this in the answer to the last question, but how did your books, these books in particular, come about? What made you decide to write about the subjects that you have? Colin, don't feel obligated to explain each book individually.
Okay, you want me to go first? I started writing articles about aviation heroes and such, and then I got involved in space programs with people such as Paul Scully-Power, the Australian-born oceanographer, and we put together a book on his life. And I really got the writing bug about that. And I'd earlier put together a small book for school children called Space, the New Frontier. And it gave me an idea, because in that book, I put together not only the stories of the American astronauts, but the Soviet cosmonauts and people from other countries who flew in space. And that was the genesis of the idea for the very first book in the Outward Odyssey series. But I will credit one person with being the genesis of the Outward Odyssey series, and that's Krista McAuliffe. Surprisingly, I know that there's some raised eyebrows going on there, but when Krista's mother put together a book called A Journal for Krista, I got in touch with her and we corresponded for quite a while. And I said, I'd like to write a book for high school students about Krista's life. And I said, if you could find me an American publisher, then we could collaborate on this book. She invited me to come to Massachusetts with my wife. We did. We stayed with Grace Corrigan for several days. And when the manuscript was ready, she submitted it to her publisher, the University of Nebraska Press. They loved it. I wrote another book for them called Fallen Astronauts, along with Kate Doolan. And then the series editor got in touch with me, or the chief editor at that time, Gary Dunham, and he said, would you be prepared to put together a series of books about the story of space exploration? We came to an agreement. As I said, I had no editing background, nothing like that, but enthusiasm. And that was the very beginning of Outward Odyssey. I can explain more about it later on, so I'll give other people a chance to chime in.
All right, Michelle, why the X-15?
Well, I grew up with the X-15. You know, I grew up with the space program, being born in the mid-50s. It came along about the same time I did. But looking at the television coverage and everything, it was all happening on the East Coast of the United States. And the X-15 was happening not too far away from where I lived here in Southern California. And it also turns out my dad worked with the space program here. His territory included places like Edwards, China Lake, those sorts of places. And he used to take me along as a kid. I first went with him on a trip when I was in kindergarten. He picked me up after school one day and said, hey, I'm heading up to Edwards, and would you like to come along? And that got me hooked. Going out there to the high desert and seeing this stuff happening for real was so different than watching it on television. So I've had this passion for the X-15 for so long. My hero growing up was Joe Walker. He was the be-all and end-all of these guys who were the astronauts. It's like Neil Armstrong was out there. I met him actually long before he became an astronaut in Houston at the Cape. But again, Joe Walker, he was the man. He was the cool guy. So just this idea that somewhere along the line I wanted to write a book. I didn't know what I was going to do, and all of a sudden it hit me one day when I was reading someone else's book that happened to be talking about the X-15. It's like, that's what I need to write about. And that afternoon I called up to Edwards, to the history office, and said, I want to write a book about the X-15. What can you do to help? And they said, well, come on up. So I packed up the car and headed up there the next day, started doing a bunch of research. And then he's like, well, you know, Milt Thompson, he's one of the X-15 pilots. He's still over in the astronaut or in the the flight office. Would you like to talk to him? And of course, I was not prepared at all for doing an interview that day, but you don't turn down an interview. So it's like, sure. And I headed over there and we sat down and talked, and that started what turned out to be 70 some interviews with these pilots and the managers and the tech guys and the rocket shop guys. And it's just been an amazing journey. And to be able to be part of the Outward Odyssey series, that part of it, that part of the story goes directly to Francis, who I've known for many years. And he put me in touch with Colin, and the rest is, as we say, history. So.
All right. Thank you so much. And speaking of whom, Francis.
Thank you, David. I think the audience are getting an idea of just how much quirky, untold, different stories that we're talking about here. This is not the standard, we went to the moon, we did this, though those stories are in here too. What you're hearing about, people like Jay Galantine, who's written this incredible human story of unmanned space probes and how they got to Jupiter and Saturn, how they made those decisions made by humans sitting in offices deciding things. You know, this is a very human story. What Michelle did with the X-15 was amazing, because I knew about the suborbital space plane, but I didn't really know a lot about it. You get into these books, it's incredible. And David, of course, Huntsville's shining jewel of Skylab, the first American space station, the first permanent space station, multi-crewed, that nobody knows about. It's disgusting unless they read your book. So I'm so glad and so honored to be a part of this series, because it gets into all these stories, and it gets to what I'm interested in, which is, you know, the human stories. What I was very honored that Colin asked me to co-author the first 2 books that I ever did. Colin at that point had numerous, literally dozens of books published before. This was the first time I was doing this. But we both shared something in that we were both not from the US or the USSR. Colin's from Australia, I'm from England. And so we weren't seeing these stories as this is our story and their story. And every book we read from the Soviet Union was pretty heavily sanitized, but it was clear there were some fascinating human stories behind that. Every story we read from America was, we did this, and then there are these evil others, the communists who we're fighting, and you know they're doing their stuff, but those are the enemy. And there's a certain point we thought, well, okay, the Cold War is over at this point. Who were these people? Because you look at folks like the first person in space, the first woman in space. A lot of times people are joining thinking, I like to fly airplanes. I can't afford to do it privately. I'm going to join my military because I love flying. It wasn't an ideological love. It was I want to fly jets. They're going to pay me? Sure. Okay, now I'll find out who I'm going to go bomb. That doesn't matter. I want to fly this plane. So the human stories are fascinating. And we started that a couple of decades ago at a time, fortunately, when most of those original spacefarers were still around. It's sad to think now that most of them are gone, but it is still a very tiny part of human history we're talking about. Michelle mentioned Joe Walker. We're coming up in 2021 when the very first people to go into space were born 100 years ago. We've got John Glenn, we've got a cosmonaut, and we've got Joe Walker before either of them. 100 years ago, next year, the very first person was born who one day would graze the edges of space. So our entire work is a century old and nothing more, nothing less. And so there's so much that we can cover there. So I think you can tell my excitement level on this. I'm in, and I want to keep going. And if people on this group haven't read these books yet, read them because they are wonderful.
Very true. Very true. Jay.
Well, I've written a lot about unmanned lunar and planetary missions and the little probes that go out and do them and the people that have sent them. And I guess the dirty little secret is that's not what I was primarily interested in when I applied to be in the series. So I had heard about the series on Robert Perlman's just excellent Collect Space website. And it said, you know, if you're interested, we have 8 books that we're going to do. We have authors for 4 of them, but we need authors for the other 4. And contact this guy named Colin Burgess if you want to find out more. And so I got in touch with Colin, and my initial reaction after connecting with him was, dang, all the good ones are taken. The one that I really wanted to do was the Apollo one, and that had already been snatched up. And then the ones about the Mercury and the Gemini astronauts, those are being done by Colin and Francis. And I was kind of like, shoot, what do you got left? And he said, well, you know, we're going to do a couple on the shuttle. And I was like, well, never, I mean, I grew up with the shuttle, but I wasn't really into it. You know, I really had it bad for those Apollo guys in their white suits. That's what I really wanted to write about. But dang, it was taken. And I said, you know, what else you got? He's like, well, I'm going to do one on the Russians. I'm like, I don't know anything about the Russians. I don't speak Russian. No. What else do you have? He's like, well, I've got this one on space probes. And I'm like, I think those are the chapters that I skipped over in all the Apollo books that I read. You know, there would be a chapter on like the precursor missions and finding the way for the Apollo journeys and Surveyor and Ranger and this stuff. And honestly, I always skipped over those chapters when I was reading the books because I wanted to get to what I thought was the good stuff. And so I went to my local library and I got a whole bunch of books on just the planets and exploring the solar system. And I felt like there were a lot of unanswered questions in there about what we've been talking about over this whole series is really the backstories of the people who have created these things, the people who are actually doing the work. I kind of felt like that was missing from these books. And I eventually talked to somebody who talked to somebody else who put me in touch with one of the people who was an engineer on the Mars rover, Spirit and Opportunity. And I'm like, Chris, what can you tell me, you know, that I haven't been reading online or whatever? And he was like, let me tell you, there was this one night, it was 3 o'clock in the morning and we're all dead tired. We've been sleeping in the halls. We've been living off ice cream bars. And I went to do an integration test at 3 o'clock in the morning and I plugged it in like this and it was supposed to plug in like this. And I thought I had shorted out a $300 million rover. And I was like, holy cow, I've never heard that. That's the kind of story I want to write. And I'm like, I think there could be really something here, something new, something that's a contribution. And so I scratched all that together into a proposal. And by the time I finished writing that proposal and sending it off to Colin, I was just in love with this whole idea of creating these machines and sending them off. And that's how I got here.
As many of these as we've done, I don't think I've fully heard that stories before. So allow me to formally thank you for passing on the shuttle book because I was the beneficiary of that. So thank you. John, what's your story?
Well, Jay's a tough act to follow there, but I respond like him. I responded to the Collect Space call from Colin, you know, to help out with the Apollo book. And sorry, Jay, I was one of the guys that got the job. I guess I replied within about 3 minutes of it posting. But Footprints in the Dust was a great, I mean, for somebody like me, this would be my first creative writing experience. Great training wheels to get into it and learn what it takes to, each of us were limited to about 40 or 50 pages for each one of these missions. And in that little bit of word count, you think, oh, I can do this, no problem. But then once you get into it and you realize how sharp you have to be as far as the details and getting the story right. Interviews are a big part of that. A lot of research is part of that. But then you've got it finished, you think it's perfect, you send it in, and then the wonderful Francis points out a glaring error in your script there that you're like, how did I get that wrong? So Footprints was a great learning experience. And then you know, several years go by and I have to credit Mel Croft, my co-author, with coming up with the idea for Come Fly With Us, the story about the payload specialists. And Colin put the two of us together and said, would I be interested in working with Mel? And I said, sure, that's a great idea. Like working with Mel. And at first, though, you know, the payload specialist story sounds like one of those things that it's going to be hard getting people to want to read that. Coming up with a good title, I think, was key to that book being successful. But once we got into it, again, like Jay was saying, once you get into these stories and get to know these people and do the interviews, it's amazing they haven't written their own books or somebody else hasn't written a book about that subject before. Another great thing about the Outward Odyssey series is that it allows people to delve into these other aspects of spaceflight history that probably otherwise wouldn't have been done. And I think when it's all over with, one of these days, whenever the end of this project comes, I think this is going to be the premier reference to space flight. When everybody goes to look for the history, they're going to look to this series because it encompasses so much more than anybody else has ever been able to do.
You listen to all of these stories and you kind of hear the, the variations circling common themes. And yeah, you really hit on, I mean, the Outward Odyssey series at its heart is books that probably otherwise would not have been written by people who probably otherwise would not have written them. So we owe a huge debt of thanks to Colin as authors for the opportunity, and as spaceflight aficionados for the wonderful series that's been created. My story with homesteading space was not terribly dissimilar. I was working at the time as a NASA education writer, doing research for what was going to be a 1,000-word long 3-part series on the history of Skylab. In the process of researching, this little tiny short thing I'm going to write about Skylab, kind of had the thought, man, there's not a lot out here about Skylab. Somebody should do a book about it. And it took about 8 months before I realized that person was apparently me. And Colin and I were connected through my co-author, Owen Garriott, but also through, as others have said, the Collect Space website. And the rest, as they say, is history. And I'm now changing my Bold They Rise story to be that Colin called me up one night in tears saying that Jay Galantine had refused the shuttle book. Did I know anybody? And, helping him out in his moment of desperation. Colin for that book caught me at just the right moment when homesteading was still fresh enough that it was exciting, but far enough back that I had kind of forgotten the pain of childbirth, and so I signed up to do it again. But I'm a child of the shuttle era, and so it was a real privilege to get to write a love letter to the space shuttle program